Recording in progress.
Okay, good morning everyone. Sorry for the delays, and it's lovely to see so many people here live. So I really just wanted to use today to finish off this section of the sugya. I think that Sosis we spoke about, Korah we discussed. So Noistin Klitach Hasadlaf, I'll talk about just for a few minutes. It says my internet connection is unstable. I don't know if anyone can hear me or not. Yeah, Josh or Adam, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Noistin Klitach Hasadlaf. So I'll just mention a couple of ha'oros on this. I won't go into this. I won't go into this in detail. One of the things that the post can talk about on Noistin Klitach Hasadlaf is the issue of Mevatel is the issue of graf shalrei. So the halacha is that something which is unpleasant and contaminated, you are allowed to move on Shabbos, even though it should be classic Mukta, because it's dirty water, dirty liquid. Nonetheless, you're allowed to move it on Shabbos if it is in an area where it will interfere with your use of that space. And this is a kula in Hilchos Mukta in order to allow people not to have unpleasant things around on Shabbos. So this is relevant to parents with babies that have nappies, perhaps a bin that is overflowing on Shabbos and the like. Even though fundamentally these are Mukta, nonetheless you are allowed to move these on Shabbos because of the halacha of graf shalrei. Graf shalrei was a chamber pot or the like, which should be classic Mukta, nonetheless was allowed to be moved on Shabbos. The simplest answer to the question. If you would ask over here, which some of the poskim do, that there should be a graf shalrei and there should be allowed to be moved, the question is built on an assumption about how exactly unclean is this delaf. The Gemara's answer is that we're talking about a delaf that's royal ishtiyah, but in the Havamina exactly how unclean is the water, is it indeed unpleasant to have around? But it's a nice example of bringing out the difference between the different reasons of Mevatel Kli MeHechano. If Mevatel Kli MeHechano is that you can't move it, or that you can't move it, then the question is a good question. If graf shalrei can be moved, then surely you can't say that this looks like boina, that something is fixed to the ground, because you are able to move it. If the issue with Mevatel Kli MeHechano is soisa, that you're ruining the utensil because it now becomes unusable for anything else because it becomes Mukta, then graf shalrei would be a very good example of Mevatel Kli MeHechano, because even though you can move it because it's unpleasant, nonetheless you have no fuller type of Muktza than this. You're literally making it into a chamber pot. I mean, what bigger Mevatel Kli MeHechano is there? If the reason for Mevatel Kli MeHechano is because you're removing Kelim, for example, from Shabbos use, or fundamentally making something Muktza is an of in itself a use for which something is not prepared, then again that would apply to graf shalrei. So even though the question on delaf is not the greatest question in the world, in other words, the question we'd ask is, how can the Gemara say that delaf is Mevatel Kli MeHechano? Surely the halacha is that graf shalrei you can move. So that question itself is an interesting question that the poskim ask, but one could answer that we're not talking here about profoundly unpleasant water. But nonetheless, it does bring out a deeper point, which is, does the halacha Mevatel Kli MeHechano apply when you are making something into a graf shalrei, into something which you can move on Shabbos because it's so profoundly horrible, like making something into a chamber pot? Can you make something into a chamber pot into a potty, into a chamber pot on Shabbos? So if the reason for Mevatel Kli MeHechano is soisa, then maybe you could, because you can still move this, even though it is Mevatel Kli MeHechano, even though it's Mukta. So it wouldn't be Mevatel Kli MeHechano. But if you learn the reason for Mevatel Kli MeHechano is the other reasons, sorry, it would still be boina. It wouldn't be boina because you can move it. And if you learn the reason for Mevatel Kli MeHechano is the other reasons, like soisa, destroying a utensil, or fundamentally making something Mukt on Shabbos is forbidden, or making things unusable on Shabbos is a diminution of the of covered Shabbos, then those reasons would still apply. So this is another nafkamina between the different reasons we saw. We saw Rashi in one place says the problem is boina because you're fixing something to the spot. That may not apply to graf shalrei, but the other reasons Rashi gives, like soisa, or the Rishonim that say it's fundamentally making something Mukta, would still apply to graf shalrei. So I just mentioned that as a ha'ara on the sugya.
The reasoning when it's simply a colour in particular.
Since there is a leniency that something which is profoundly unpleasant, a graf shalrei, can be moved on Shabbos, the question would be whether making something into a graf shalrei would be Mevatel Kli MeHechano on Shabbos.
But it could, all I'm saying is you could still argue it's Mevatel Kli MeHechano, but there's a colour.
There's a colour that you can move it on Shabbos. Yeah. So would that allow the reasoning of Mevatel Kli MeHechano to make sense? So what is the reason for Mevatel Kli MeHechano? If the reason of Mevatel Kli MeHechano is that it's like fixing it to its space, then the colour would undermine that reason, because you can move it, so it's not fixed to its space. Rashi says that, but Rashi by us says that the reason for Mevatel Kli MeHechano is boina, because you're fixing it to its space. But this is a type of Mukta where uniquely, even though it's the most awful type of Mukta, in a way it's the most fundamental Mukta, you're making something into something disgusting, nonetheless you can move it on Shabbos, and therefore maybe it wouldn't be Mevatel Kli MeHechano. But if the reason of Mukta is sosa, that you're destroying the utensil by making it Mukta, you can't use it for anything now, or the reason is that fundamentally making things Mukta is also on Shabbos, because it's not prepared for that use or the like, then that would apply even for Graf Shalrei. That's the rationale.
I'm just saying, Rashi is saying Kirkovea, he's not saying it is actually fixed.
It's not actually fixed, because you can physically move it. It's not cemented. That's true, but what's the Gezerah? It's not cemented to the spot, but since halachically you can't move it, that appears to be a type of boina. But here you have a unique Mukta, which halachically you can move. So if you can halachically move it, then that wouldn't be boina. You're not looking happy about this, Paul. I don't like you being unhappy. Okay. Halachically you can move it. It's a unique Mukta, where because it's unpleasant, there's a suspension of the issa to move it if it's in a living space, if it's in a livable space.
The Gemara seems to bring three different kinds of examples. So the first case is when you're catching the oil, and you're not going to spill the oil out because you want that oil, and so that's Mevatel Kli MeHechano. On the other hand, he talks about catching a candle, which you can do, because you can, once you caught the candle, you can push it out straight away and then use the Keli. And then in the middle he's got catching cinders, which you've got to keep those cinders in there for a short while, and then you could put them out, but just that short while where you want to keep it in there makes it also. So based on that, you've got this glove. At the end of the day, you can move it or you cannot move it, but you want it there to catch the glove, and you're not going to move it for at least a short while.
It's not a comparison. The point of the Mishnah Berurah we'll get to, we visited it before and we'll visit it again later, which is if something is Mukta for a short while, would that be Mevatel Kli MeHechano? And we'll get it again back to Efrochim in a few minutes. Over here, the logic is that you can move it instantly. As soon as the drip, this unpleasant drip falls in it, assuming it's horrible, smelly water, you could move it instantly if you chose to do so, and therefore the argument would be it was never forbidden to be moved, and therefore it never became a Mevatel Kli MeHechano. That would be the logic. The issue of temporary Mukta we've touched on before, and we'll touch on again. We'll touch on later. We spoke about it, for example, within Tzotzos. At what point do they become ein mehem mamish? While there's still sparks, are they Mukta or not? And we'll speak about it again in other scenarios.
I thought we had with the chickens.
We'll get to their Efrochim in a few minutes.
You could shoot them off immediately.
So we'll come to Efrochim soon. We haven't actually learned Efrochim properly. We touched on this in Shiur. Tosa says that since you could be mafrish tevel, therefore it never became a Mevatel Kli MeHechano. And we discussed what's the logic. So what? You could be mafresh tevel be'issa. I mean, you could tip off the egg be'issa, and why would that make a difference? And we gave two answers. Either the Rishonim explained, the Rashba explained that since you can tie the tevel, that's a weakness in the Mukta from the start, whereas the egg, there's no weakness in the Mukta, you can tip it off, but the egg remains Mukta. Or tipping off is like de-cementing something, removing the cement from something, very clever. But in the meantime, it's got Mukta on, so therefore it's cemented to the ground, whereas with the tevel, you can tide it. So we'll get to all of that with Efrochim in a couple of minutes, even less, but that's, either way, with the Laf Shalrei, the question that the poskim are asking is, again, I can't pretend I think it's the greatest question, because you could, maybe this water is dirty enough that it's not royu, but not so dirty that it's unpleasant, and therefore could be moved. But the question they ask is, if it's so unpleasant that you can move it, they say it wouldn't be Mevatel Kli MeHechano. I'm simply pointing out that in practical halacha, are you allowed to use a bowl as can you make a bowl into a chamber pot on Shabbos? It would depend on the reasons for Mevatel Kli MeHechano. If the problem with Mevatel Kli MeHechano is moving, then maybe you could, because you can move a Graf Shalrei, at least in some limited form, to move it out. Whereas if the problem is sosa or making something Muktza, then you wouldn't be able to do it. That's just a sort of but let's go to Efrochim, because this brings out this other point about temporary things. So the Gemara says, "Kofin es asal lifnei Efrochim." Shiyalu v'yardu. You're allowed to put a basket in front of Efrochim so that they can go up and down. It seems like they like roosting on these things, or it's convenient for you to have the Efrochim there on this sal. And the Gemara says, Kasava Muktza l'taltaloi. They hold that you're allowed to move. It's not Mevatel MeHechano because you're allowed to move the sal because you can chase away the Efrochim. Now let's just work through.
Sorry, can I just ask on the? You said that they like roosting on there or whatever. The tosfot, there's a small tosfot which seems to imply not. It says it's some sort of Hatzalah. We're trying to work out what it is.
Yeah, I don't know what that is. I don't know if Tosfos meant that. It depends how you learn Hatzalah Matsuya. If you learn that Hatzalah is a heter, that they cancelled the Isurim in order to avoid a loss, then Tosfos evidently means there's a Hatzalah here. Somehow it's protecting their Frochim, and I'm not sure what that protection is. If all Hatzalah Matsuya means it's a common thing to do, then Tosfos is just using borrowed terminology when he says Hatzalah Matsuya, and he simply says it's a normal thing to do. Everyone puts out Salim for their Frochim to clamber on, and that's and therefore since it's regular, they didn't. It may not be included in the. It wouldn't be included in the Takana. So it depends how you translate Hatzalah in the Gemara. Yeah, I don't know. Did anyone manage to find out why people put?
There was a note in the
article
that suggested that the birds use the basket as a kind of aid to climbing into their nest. So it would suggest that if they couldn't climb into the nest,
they can't get into the nest.
They may get carried off by a predator or something. That might be something. Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if those online heard that. So yeah. So the article. Thank you. Okay. So either way, what's the Gemara's answer? That's Muktza l'taltaloi, because you can cause the Efrochim to fly away, or they fly away by themselves. So if we hold, like I've mentioned several times, the view of the Baal Hamor, that something which a temporary bosses is not a bosses, and a temporary mosses is not Mevatel MeHechano, then the Gemara's answer is very good. This is by definition a temporary thing. When you catch ashes in a Keli, when you catch an egg in a Keli, when you catch a delaf in a utensil, in all those cases it sits there till the end of Shabbos unless you do something. Whereas with Efrochim, the whole use is temporary, and therefore this doesn't become a bossis and it doesn't become a Mevatel MeHechano. That's what the Baal Hamor would answer. But we saw that most, as I mentioned again and again, this is a minority opinion. Almost everyone argues on the Baal Hamor, or perhaps everyone, all the Rishonim seem to argue on the Baal Hamor. They all hold that something which temporarily has something on is a bossis. So what's the answer of the Gemara? So there's a number of ways of saying it. One answer of the Gemara could be a bit like Tosfos' svara that we saw before, that if you can remove the Mukta without doing any action whatsoever, that wouldn't be Mevatel MeHechano. The whole point of Mevatel MeHechano is, let's say, like Rashi, that it looks like Bona because it's cemented to the ground. But Tosfos said more than that. Even if you could tie the tevel, the Gemara really says this, but this is how Tosfos explains it. Even if you could tie the tevel, that would make it not Mevatel MeHechano, even though it's be'issa, but nonetheless you're not doing anything physical to it. Even though now it's Mukta, but nonetheless you could remove the Mukta without any physical change. That's not Mevatel MeHechano. Mevatel MeHechano is where something is permanently fixed. Over here, with no action whatsoever, it can be cancelled. So since the Efrochim hop on and hop off, this doesn't look like fixing something in its place. It doesn't look like Mevatel MeHechano. And maybe we can say more than that. You can chase them off without having to do any action to the object itself. With the egg, you have to remove the egg in order to allow the movement of the Keli. That would be equivalent to moving the cement. There wouldn't be enough to stop it being Mevatel MeHechano. But with the chicks, you can just clap your hands and frighten them, and they will move off. And therefore, that's not called Mevatel MeHechano. So that would be a simple answer. So that's seemingly the reason for Mevatel MeHechano. And this ties in then to this point that you were saying from the Mishnah, that something which is a temporary Mukta, according to the Baal Hamor, would not be Mevatel MeHechano, but according to everyone else, it would be if it involved you changing the situation, like shaking off the egg or the like. But if it's something that happens automatically, like the Nitzotzos ceasing to be sparks and just becoming ashes, or here with Efrochim where you can do it without an action, or with the tevel where you can tide it, then that would be enough to stop the. It doesn't look like Mevatel MeHechano because there's no permanence. There's a fundamental non-permanence. This. So that's sorry.
I just think I have to think about that a bit more because I think the Mishnah Torah mentions catching a candle. That candle is definitely Muktza. And so when you catch it, you're going to have to change the situation. And yet it says it's still okay.
Because?
Because you can tip it out.
Because what, sorry?
Because he says you can just tip it out.
So how's that different to the beta? An egg you can also tip out.
Yeah, I don't know.
No.
Maybe you would break the egg if you tipped it out.
I don't know. Okay.
So what's the scenario catching candle?
Let's put them on hold just because we're time and it's not a case that we have in the Gemara. And let's work it out off group, and if we come to any answers, put it on the WhatsApp group just in the interest of timing. Okay. Just to summarize though, the main point is that if you have something which is going to be temporarily a bossis and temporarily Mevatel Kli MeHechano, the Halacha L'maisa is this is enough to call it Mevatel Kli MeHechano, only in a situation where immediately you could remove it. If you so choose, did it never become a bossis and therefore, or at least never become Mevatel Kli MeHechano, and therefore it would be okay. So in the case of the tevel, you could immediately tithe it. In the case of the Afrochim, you could immediately chase them off. Whereas in the case of any other cases, at least it's temporarily a bossis, and we paskin that a temporary bossis is a bossis, and therefore Mevatel Kli MeHechano would apply, unlike the minority of the opinion of the Banamah that says not. So we've visited this in several scenarios, but that's the simplest halacha. Okay, so to summarize, the answer to the Gemara is that there's something impermanent about Afrochim more than the other cases. In all the other cases, at least while they're permanently there, even though later they'll be removed, whereas in this case, either the Afrochim hop on and off the whole time, and therefore there's no permanence, or even more than that, I can actually chase them off whenever I wish to do so, and that's not called a bossis. The Gemara asks on that, Vatanya asur l'talteloi, surely asur l'talteloi, and the Gemara answers, ba'oid olav, while it's still on it. So this is really one of the proofs against the Baal Hamor, because the Gemara seems to answer that even though you could chase off their frochim whenever you want, and even though frochim are very temporary, they're chicks or scatty-brained things that jump on and off without much permanence and don't stay on for long, nonetheless, whilst they are on, it would be asa. So this sounds like the Baal Hamor, unlike the Baal Hamor. In other words, we're answering, since you could chase them off whenever you want, it doesn't become Mevatel Kli MeHechano. But while the chicks are on the sal, the Gemara says explicitly that it is Muktza, seemingly not like the Baal Hamor. The Baal Hamor would have to learn this Gemara, that the Gemara doesn't mean that the sal is Mukta. It simply means to say that in practice you couldn't move the sal, because by moving the sal you would be moving the chicks. So I just want to mention this to remind ourselves of what we've said previously, and we need to remind ourselves again. The truth is, when you have a container that contains Mukta, there's two reasons why you can't move it. Reason number one is because by moving the Keli, you're moving the Mukta, and you're not allowed to move Mukta on Shabbos, not because of any hilchos bosses, but just because you're moving the object. This is known in Halacha as tiltul min hatzad, tiltul indirectly from the side via something else. So I'm not allowed on Shabbos to move a Mukta item directly, and I also can't move it by moving something else, at least some types of Mukta. So something which is Mukta machmas gufa, where it's fundamentally Mukta, I can't move because I'm moving something else. That's one issue. Our sugya, at least according to how Rashi is learning, the point isn't that there's something stopping me moving the bowl. The point is the bowl has become Mukta by becoming bossis. So most Rishonim learn the sugya that the Gemara is saying that while the Afrochim are on it, it is a bossis because I can't move the bowl because the bowl has become a bossis, and therefore there's a thought that it would be Mevatel Kli MeHechano, and the Gemara says no, it's not Mevatel Kli MeHechano because you can chase off the Afrochim whenever you want. But while the Afrochim are on it, it is a bossis. That even though it's very, very temporary, nonetheless for those few moments it's a bossis. The Baal Hamor argues, and he says no, something can't become a temporary bossis. The reason the Gemara is saying you can't move it isn't because it has become Mukta, it's because there's something else on top of it which I can't move. Most Rishonim learn that wouldn't be enough for Mevatel Kli MeHechano. Mevatel Kli MeHechano is where it fundamentally becomes Mukta. Rashi emphasizes that several times. If there's a side issue stopping you moving it, that wouldn't make it Mukta, and therefore that wouldn't make it Mevatel Kli MeHechano.
Isn't the bird case the same as the tevel case? In the same way that you can chase the bird away, you can fix the tevel.
Correct. So it's the same as the tevel case and even better. It's better on two counts. The tevel case, I would have to do an issa by tithing it. The birds, there's no issa. The tevel case, if I do nothing, it will stay. With the birds, it's very impermanent from the start because they jump on and off. So the Gemara, this is the tevel case plus. Nonetheless, since it's so impermanent, even though the simplest reading of the Gemara is that while the efrochim are on it, it does become a bosses, and whilst the tevel is untithed, it does become a bosses. Nonetheless, it's not mevatel kli MeHechano because it's too impermanent to be that.
So in this case, the Gemara asks, or the Gemara answers that the birds were there ben hashmashot. It doesn't.
We'll come to ben hashmashot in a minute.
It doesn't make the point that the tevel might have been there ben hashmashot.
No, correct. We'll come to that in a few moments. But yes, that's great. Okay, just to summarize, because I don't want us to come out confused from here. There's three layers of halacha. Layer number one is that when you have a utensil with Mukta sitting inside it, you can't move the utensil because through so doing you will move the Mukta, and that is called tiltul min atad, an indirect moving of the Mukta. That's number one. That in and of in itself, the pashtus, on face value, other than perhaps the minority opinion of the Balamor, is not enough to make it mevatel kli MeHechano, because the kli is still fundamentally movable. It just has something stopping you moving it, which is if I move the Keli, I'll be moving Mukta. But in and of in itself, the utensil hasn't become unmovable. There are other scenarios where you can't move things because of their effect, and that's not called mevatel kli MeHechano. For example, the scenario we gave was if you have an object sitting on a branch, weighing the branch down, and if you move the object, you will move the branch of the tree. So that's not mevatel kli MeHechano, because the Keli is not Mukta. It just happens to be. If I move that, I will be moving a Mukta. That's not called mevatel kli MeHechano. Rashi says it's only scenario number two which is mevatel kli MeHechano, which is where the object becomes fundamentally a bossis. Now the object has turned into Mukta. That is mevatel kli MeHechano, making a Keli Mukta. So level number one is where the Keli is not Mukta. It's just by moving it, I'll be moving Mukta tiltul min atzad. That definitely doesn't make mevatel kli MeHechano. Level number two is where the Keli becomes Mukta. It fundamentally turns into Mukta. That is translation of mevatel kli MeHechano. I've cancelled use of something. Does every case where I turn something into a bossis make mevatel kli MeHechano? The chiddush of our omot is no, not where it's fixable. Because even though in the meantime it's become a bossis, but since it's in my power to fix it, that doesn't make it mevatel kli MeHechano because I can unravel the bossis and unravel the fixing case. This is the majority reading of the sugya. Minority reading of the sugya is the Bal Hamor, who says that if something becomes temporarily bossis, it doesn't become a bossis. If something temporarily is holding something, it doesn't become a bossis, and therefore there's nothing to talk about over here. And the reason for mevatel kli MeHechano is because I'm moving the Mukta. I'm only mentioning this because it's a important opinion on Halacha, but it's not the mainstream reading of our sugya. I'm using almost the Balamar as a foil to compare and contrast. The mainstream reading of the sugya is its own mevatel kli MeHechano, where you make something Mukta. How do you make something Mukta on Shabbos? By making it into a bosses, where it now becomes Mukta, not because I'll be moving the Mukta through so doing, but because it's become the container of Mukta. The chiddush of bosses is something which is a receptacle for Mukta, has now been allocated a new use, and therefore is also Mukta, and therefore it is forbidden. This is that's the discussion in Gemara, and therefore the Gemara says over here that whilst the efrochim are on the Keli, it is a bossis. Indeed, it is a bossis, because you can have temporary bosses on Shabbos. That's the view of the mainstream Rishonim. But since the efrochim can easily be chased off, or even better than that, they jump on and off themselves, that wouldn't be enough to make it mevatel kli MeHechano. It's too impermanent for the gezerah of mevatel kli MeHechano to make sense. That's the summary of this part of the sugya.
Can I ask, is there a difference between the efrochim and the tevel? Because in the tevel, what you're fixing is the tevel itself. You stop the tevel being Muktza, so the thing that it's a basis to isn't Muktza anymore. Here, the efrochim remain Muktza, it's just they're not on it. So is there a difference in those two?
There is such a difference, and we said that difference with the egg. That with the egg you could argue the egg remains Mukta, whereas the also doesn't. It's true, but on the other hand here you have a strength, which is that it's the efrochim are impermanent and jump off by themselves. I can chase them off without doing any issa. There's no issa to chase. You're not allowed to catch efrochim on Shabbos because it's sold, but it's seder, but you're not trapping, but you're allowed to chase efrochim off the container on Shabbos, and therefore there's not. The Gemara is saying it's too impermanent. Ask the Gemara of Tanya, afal pisha ein oid on olav asa. Surely you've learned in a brayso that even when the efrochim are not on it, it's asa. And that the Gemara answers that it was there kol bein hashmashos. But let's just think for a moment about the question of the Gemara. The Gemara is asking on itself, but surely we've learned a brayso that says that even when the efrochim aren't on the sal, it's Mukta. What's the Gemara thinking over here? What the one's asking as if it's a question on this opinion of Mevatel Kli MeHechano. How can you say it's not Mevatel Kli MeHechano? We have the price that says even if no efroichim on it, it is a bossis. I mean, what on earth would that mean? That's stomach kasher. We have a schwer price. We have a difficult price. We have a price that says that even when the chicks are not on the sal, it's osa. It's not a problem on this. The one's asking as if it's an abstract question. According to the Manza Omar, that Mevatel Kli MeHechano, that the problem of our mission is Mevatel Kli MeHechano, how do you explain the price which says that efroichim even when they're not on it osa? It's not a question. That when efroichim aren't on the sal, why on earth should it be osa? It's not a bosses for anything. I mean, what would it be? The one gives a good answer. Bein hashmashas, it becomes fixed as a mukta for whatever reason. We'll try and get to that in this week's shiur. For some reason, bein hashmashas determines the mukta status the whole of Shabbos. But why in the Havamim of the Gemara? What does the Gemara think? So there's a ritva. I should have probably given out the ritva in the sources because it's such a beautiful and profound and fundamental idea. I'll try and put it on the WhatsApp group over the break just so that everyone can have a look at it. There's a ritva who answers. I'm going to slightly misquote the ritva just to make it clearer. There is a halacha, a rare halacha, that some things can be so dedicated to a use that they become a bossis even when they actually don't contain the Mukta in them. And the most common application of this is a purse or a wallet. I don't know if any of you remember in the olden days when we used to use cash. So we used to store it in wallets or purses. I don't know when the last time I've touched a coin. It's quite bizarre. So it's a whole area of halacha that our children and grandchildren are going to struggle to understand. A container for credit cards would be another example of that. Yes. So the halacha is that a kiss, a purse, a wallet is a bossis even if it happens to have no money sitting inside it, because it's so dedicated for a Muktza use that it's intrinsically a bossis even when not. Again, the logic of bossis is I'm making something subservient to Mukta. It becomes a mere base or container for Mukta, and therefore it too becomes Mukta. There are objects which are so dedicated for their use that they are fundamentally Mukta, even though there's no physical change to them. Now, a potty, which we mentioned before, graf shalrei, the reason it's mukta isn't because of this chidush of being a permanent bosses, is because it itself becomes moros, it itself is horrible, and you wouldn't use it for anything else. The wallet, in no way does it become moros. It's a perfectly usable container for anything. You could use it for all sorts of things. Nonetheless, since this is dedicated for a mukta role, it's in a permanent state of bosses, even if there happens to be nothing sitting inside it. So the Ritva talks about another scenario of the same, of a similar sort of halacha, and he says that that's why, that was the Havamim of the Gemara, that this sal, even when it has nothing, no efroichim on top of it, is a bossis because it's set aside for efroich hopping. For whatever reason, people want their frochim to climb onto things, and therefore it would be mukta even if nothing's on it. That's the havamina of the Gemara.
That only works because the basket's specifically for that. It was made for that.
Correct. It has to be made and dedicated for one particular mukta function. Yes. And the havamina of the Gemara was that sal was like that. It was dedicated for a particular mukta use.
Edward's explanation would work well with that.
Yeah, if it's a permanent ladder of sorts or something, then that would work well. Did the article quote a source for this, or?
Unhappily, no.
Unhappily, no. Fine. Okay.
It's a bit surprising with the Mevatel Kli MeHechano then, given you're using it, what it was always made for.
Enoch Nami. It would turn it on its head, because if it's permanently Mukta, it couldn't be Mevatel Kli MeHechano because it was anyway Mukta from beforehand. That is correct. Yeah. So when the Gemara says "Ba'od on olav, afa b'she'ein on olav asa," that would mean that it's permanently mukta. In which case, yeah. So I think the answer is sorry.
Could you say that that's not a question on our sugi? That's a question on the Raja itself.
Yeah. So I think that is correct. So what's the Brisa saying when it says you can't put it in front of the Reuven? I think the answer would be that you have this sal. The sal is a perfectly regular sal. You put it in front of the efroichim on Shabbos, that's Mevatel Kli MeHechano, because at this point you're dedicating it to efroich use, and therefore even when the efroichim aren't on it, it would remain a bosses because it's now dedicated for efroich use. So it would come out from this halacha l'maisa, you're not allowed to dedicate a bag for a wallet on Shabbos. That would be the equivalent of this, because you're making it into a bosses without actually tangibly putting anything into it. That would be the equivalent of it. Now, I still remain unsure. It could be it's only the moment that the Ephraim hops onto it for the first time that it becomes basket. That's what it sounds like in this Haverman of the Gemara, that the moment you specify this utensil for Ephraim hopping use, and the moment the first Ephraim hops onto it, it becomes a permanent basket for Ephraim, even when there are no Ephraim on it anymore, because it's become dedicated for Ephraim use. That would be the reading of the Gemara. But once that has occurred, there would no longer be the constant Mevatel MeHechano for future Shabbos, because it's just permanently Mukta in the Haverman of the Gemara. All of this is a Haverman, and the Maskana is that it seems that baskets are not so dedicated for Ephraim use, and you happen to be using it now, but you could repurpose it perfectly easily, and it's not like a wallet, which people don't switch the use of.
What you said about the wallet thing, you've talked before about things not fulfilling or becoming something until they fulfill their purpose. So a door, it doesn't need a mezuzah until people are going in and out of it. A toilet, if you're building a new house, you put a toilet in, you put down in the toilet until someone's used it as a toilet. It would seem perfectly obvious that a toilet sitting in the middle of a bathroom, plumbed in, that no one's used, is still a toilet. So how does that fit in with a wallet being a wallet?
No, so you're correct. And that's in a sense the suffix I'm saying over here. What is it that specifies it to its new functionality? Is it just, it's really a separate sugya. There's a general sugya which maybe applies differently across different areas of halacha. It's known as hazmana milsa, that's the name of the sugya. Is hazmana, hazmin, to dedicate something or specify something for a purpose? Does that functionality kick in as the moment of dedication or only the moment of use? So it's a generic shiur called hazmana milsa, which differs between sugya and sugya. The Gemara discusses it, for example, in the context, the pressing context of shrouds. So shrouds are osur b'hana, because you're not allowed to be nana from a mace, a dead body, nivel ha-mace, and you're not allowed to. It's a posuk really, cover sick money. You're not allowed to benefit from a mace, and you're also not allowed to benefit from things dedicated to the use of a mace, like shrouds. So the question is that you're on the chevra, aren't you? Yeah, that's it. So so the question is, at what point do they become osur b'hana? Is it already when they're set aside to be shrouds, or only when they're used for the mace? So it's a shiur in multiple areas of Torah. It's discussed in Mukta. If you want to make a stone is a classic example of Mukta machmas gufa, it's got no use at all. What happens if I want to use my stone as a paperweight or a door stopper or the like? So what point does it become a Keli, which isn't Mukta? Is it when I pick up the stone off the street and I take it into the house planning to use it as a door stopper or a paperweight? Or is it only when I actually begin using it that it changes into the joke in Yerushalayim? I lived in Yerushalayim for many years, and the question was always about throwing stones at cars. I'm not sure this is a joke or not. Throwing stones at cars on Shabbos. Why is it not Mukta? And then the idea that you have to pile up stones before Shabbos in order to make them not Mukta, to dedicate them. I don't know if this is a black humour, but that was the. It's an amazing thing. And in the name of Shabbos, people do terrible things and forget the danger and the chil Hashem and everything else. It's Mukta, right? How can you pick up a stone? A stone is Mukta machmas gufa. So the answer is, all the stones in Yerushalayim are dedicated for the purpose of the culture war that takes place there. Okay, so that's
Just ask a sort of it's kind of slightly off topic, but it's just about how Gemara Shabbos works.
Yes.
Because we start off with this is a brisa.
Yeah.
So we say the Tana thinks the Mukt there's no question. The Gemara asks for Tanya also the Talmud.
Yes.
Now this is the same brisa, it's the next word.
Yes.
The brisa says,
Yes.
So that first question,
Yeah.
if you actually read it, you would never think So is this just a kind of the way?
So it's not entirely clear cut if the Gemara is constructing a sort of Shabbos in order to bring out a point, or there's a genuine misunderstanding over here. So he says, he holds it's Muktza. In other words, that's why you're allowed to do it. It says a minute later, he really meant that would be in a different scenario in a case where it was there from Bein Hashmashos, etc. So it would depend on.
It kind of felt like the Gemara is constructing the Shabbos.
Many agree with you that the Gemara is constructing Shabbos to bring something out, but it's possible that when he said Muktza l'taltal, he meant that. He meant it's Muktza l'taltal in certain situations, and the Asur l'taltal is a separate clause. Because that's really what the Gemara is saying. And at the end of the day, how's the Gemara reading the brisa? What is the reading of the brisa? The reading of the brisa is that Asur l'taltal is a separate clause. That's that's unavoidable, right?
Well, that's why I said
Yeah. Yeah.
But So it's saying Kosovo, which is like giving a half a minute and then responding.
Yeah. The language of the Gemara sometimes is a giveaway. I mean, you're right. In this case, Kosovo normally seems to say it's the Gemara working out what he would say rather than an actual conversation. But nonetheless, this is unavoidable. The Gemara says you're allowed to put it there on Shabbos because it wouldn't be Mevatel MeHechano, but it's also Untitled while Oidon Olav because it's Mukta, because nonetheless it becomes a Mukt bosses in the meantime. That'd be the reading of the Gemara. So however you understand the eventual reading is presumably what you meant from the beginning when you said Mukt Untitled. Okay. I'll just maybe just try and use a few minutes just to talk a little bit about Bein HaShmoshes and for us to try and understand some of the lomdas over here. I'll try and mention 4 or 5 points just to tidy up, to just finish off the sugya, and then we'll finish. Okay, so the first point over here is what is the lomdas of Bein HaShmoshes? Why should Bein HaShmoshes fix the halacha of Muktza for the rest of Shabbos? Why is Bein HaShmoshes the determinant? So here we really get to the question that maybe we should have asked in the beginning of the sugya, which is what exactly is the source of the concept of Mukta? So we discussed that Mukta isn't really a quality of an object. It's wrong to talk about is this Mukta or is this not Mukta. The way to think about it is with respect to certain uses and other uses. But there's a meta theme here, as it were, a bigger idea, which is that something that's not Mukhan is for use on Shabbos can't be used on Shabbos. And in fact, we learn it out from the Pasuk, MeHechano. The Pasuk says with the Mon in the Parsha of the Mon, MeHechano is that you need to prepare for Shabbos. Now, whether this is a full-fledged drasha min haTorah, or whether this is a drabanon built upon that pasuk, we see that one of the core themes of Shabbos isn't just lo sasek malacha, don't do creative activities on Shabbos, but also that Shabbos should be prepared for. There's a hachana. You should enter into Shabbos in a prepared state. That the objects that we use on Shabbos should be mukhan. Now, most objects are automatically mukhan. A utensil is mukhan for its use. This table is mukhan for its use. And the chiddush of kelim is that anything that's a keli is mukhan for any use. Since a chair and a table and spoons and forks and cups and everything and clothes are used for so many things, they're mukhan for any use by default. But if you have an object which isn't mukhan for any use, for example, it's a very valuable object that you wouldn't use for anything else, like an Ismail Shomila, which is one of the examples of Mukta and Machmas and Star and Kist, then it would be Mukta because it's not mukhan for other uses. If you have an object that's not mukhan for any use because it's not a keli at all, it's a stone in the street, then it would be Mukta for other uses because MeHechano. And this is the rationale of the idea why Bein HaShmoshes is the key determinant status of whether something becomes Mukta, whether something is Mukta or not, because MeHechano, Bein HaShmoshes is the time when Shabbos enters, when Shabbos starts, and therefore if it's not prepared at the start of Shabbos, it's Mukta for the whole of Shabbos. That's the logic of Bein HaShmoshes. So this is point number 1. Yes?
Why is the starting point that things, that Keli and things like that are automatically Mukta? The much more very keen in such an area is that maybe it might be that actually before Shabbos you've got to be making everything, and if you weren't making it, then it's...
I can't really answer that question other than this is the presumption of all the sugyas, that there are some things which are so mukhan that they're mukhan for anything. There is a minority opinion that even a klisha melachot leheta is only mukhan for its use, for its fundamental use. It's not mukhan for anything else. Or at least even a klisha melachot leheta is not mukhan for rare uses or for non-use just to fiddle with. It's only mutter for use. We paskin that klisha melachot leheta basically is mutter for anything because it's omeid for anything. It may not be omeid for a non-mukhan type use, which may be the earlier Gemara about ein kli nittel, and the next Gemara, in fact, ein kli nittel ela l'soich davar nittel. But the presumption is that things are mukhan v'omed, they're automatically mukhan. That's almost a synonym with the word keli. The translation of the word keli is it's dedicated and specified for human use. That's what a keli is, a utensil is, that it's only made for human use. So that it's almost synonymous with that is mukhan by a default. If you want to be sort of technical about it, say MeHechano, when did you do the preparation? By creating the keli, by purchasing it. It's prepared forever. That's what it means to be a keli, and therefore it doesn't need further preparation. So I can't tie down exactly either the Gemara is saying it's muchan v'omed, or you did a hachana by just creating it and preparing it, but this is called something that's muchan. And that's the concept of Ben Hashmashas.
When you refer to Ben Hashmashas, a period of time,
I'll come to that in a moment, it's a good point. I'm going to carry on the Shiur, but I know that people have deadlines of 10:30. I want to carry on because I would like to finish the sugya, and I'll upload the recording for those who need to dash out. But I apologise for that. I just want to finish the sugya. So I'll come on to the point of what we mean by Ben Hashmashas in a moment. But that's what but that's the lomdus of Ben Hashmashas. What happens if Ben Hashmashas, I'm planning to use it later on over Shabbos? So given that we are short of time, I'm not going to go into that into that halacha. Other than to say, certainly if you're planning to remove it on Shabbos and then reuse it and then remake it Mukta on Shabbos, then that would be Mukta Ben Hashmashas, because I'm planning for it to remain dedicated for this use over Shabbos. How does something become Mukta during Shabbos? So sorry, just to summarise again so that we're clear, because I don't want to overcomplicate this. Forget the last paragraph I just said, because I can see it gets us into deeper water that we're not going to go into. Just to summarise, Ben Hashmashas determines that something is Mukta because it's not Muchan by definition if when Shabbos starts it was Mukta. That's a scenario of Ben Hashmashas. Scenario number 2, where something becomes Mukta on Shabbos. How does it become Mukta on Shabbos? It's true that it was Muchan on Erev Shabbos, but now Shabbos started, in the middle of Shabbos I made it Mukta, so I unravelled the hachana, because now it's no longer Muchan, and therefore that cancels the hachana from Erev Shabbos, and therefore it can become Mukta on Shabbos. Does it stay permanently Mukta on Shabbos if it became Mukta on Shabbos and then I removed the cause? So something which was Mukta Ben Hashmashas remains Mukta the whole of Shabbos even if the cause went away. That's what Gemara is saying. If their froichim were on it Ben Hashmashas, it's Mukta for Shabbos because it wasn't Muchan when Shabbos came in, even though later their froichim jump off. What happens if something becomes Mukta in the middle of Shabbos and then the cause of the Mukta disappears? That would be a machlokus. You could argue either way. You could say since the hachana was cancelled, it therefore now remains Mukta forever because you've unravelled the hachana. Or you could say no, since the determinant is MeHechano, the situation was how it was at the start of Shabbos, it was Muchan. It temporarily ceased to be Muchan because it became Mukta, but now that the cause of the Mukta has gone away, it's unravelled the Mukta. So this is Hakdama number 2. So far what we've said is the determinant of Mukta status is MeHechano, how it is when Shabbos starts, point number 1. Point number 2 is if on Shabbos it becomes unusable, at that point everyone would agree it's Mukta. If on Shabbos it then reverts back to being usable, machlokus, you could look at it either way. You could say it stays Mukta because you've undone the hachana, or you could say that Mukta is undone, is that now that Mukta is undone, it goes back to its Muchan state. Next point, Gary's question, which is what do we mean actually when we say it as Mukta Ben Hashmashas? So this is a big debate. Ben Hashmashas is an interesting concept. It's this time of the start of the next day. We treat Ben Hashmashas basically as the time between sunset, when the cause of the day's light has gone away, the sun has gone away, to the time when the light of the sun has gone away, in other words, nightfall. Now exactly how dark is dark, because obviously the light gets darker and darker as time progresses. Good, that's the debate about exactly how we define Nacht. But leaving aside that debate, Ben Hashmashas is a time of confusion in Halacha, and a time of confusion in general. It's dusk, it's Erev, it's a time when things are unclear, because the body of the sun has disappeared, that's what we call sunset, but the light of the sun remains because of the properties of light bouncing off the atmosphere and so on, and therefore you still have the light of the sun without the light, and that's why it's this time of debate whether it is night or day. Now, there are a number of stances as to how to view Ben Hashmashas. It could be the whole of Ben Hashmashas is a sofek. We're not sure what the status is. Is the determinant of day the sun, or the determinant of the day sunlight? And therefore Ben Hashmashas is a time of halachic sofek. It could be that Ben Hashmashas is not halachic doubt, but fundamentally a mixture of day and night. So in other words, halacha would recognize a time which is indeterminate, which has aspects of day and night to it, and therefore it's fundamentally an indeterminate time. That's model number 2 of Ben Hashmashas. Model number 1 is Ben Hashmashas is either day or night. The whole of Ben Hashmashas is either day because it's sunshine, it's determined by the light of the sun, or it's night because it's determined by the body of the sun, which isn't there. That's model number 1. Model number 2 is it's a fundamental sofek, not in the question of doubt, but in the sense that it's fundamentally an indeterminate period, which has aspects of both. And Halacha isn't digital in this respect. It's not on-off, either day or night. Halacha recognizes that there's a time period which has aspects of both to it. That's model number 2. Model number 3 is that Bein HaShmoshes is really just a moment. At some point during the period of Bein HaShmoshes, the flip occurs between day and night, and we're just not sure when that switch occurs during that time. So in truth, Bein HaShmoshes is a second. Bein HaShmoshes Keref Ein, it's just a flick of a switch, and just remains a time which is somewhere during that time is a moment of Sofik. This is a general introduction to Bein HaShmoshes. How this translates into Hilchas Mukta is a little unclear. There are two Gesaros, by the way, also in our Gemara. Our version of the Gemara is Ba'odon Olav Kol Bein HaShmoshes, Migud Iskatzai and so on. Some of the Rishonim have a Ges of Ba'odon Olav Bein HaShmoshes, rather than Kol Bein HaShmoshes. In practical halacha, even in the case of Kol Bein HaShmoshes, you could translate where it's on it the whole of Bein HaShmoshes, or where it's on it for any time during the whole of Bein HaShmoshes. In other words, even for a moment, and it remains a significant machlokas haposkim about something which is Mukta for a moment in Bein HaShmoshes, whether that's enough to make it non-Muchan, or only where it's Mukta the whole of Bein HaShmoshes, that it would be non-Muchan. That remains a machlokas. In the interest of completion, I just want to mention a couple of other points. I'll mention just two other points, maybe. One of them actually connects very importantly with our discussion. Tosas Divrei Maskil Ba'odon Olav, I'll just mention a ha'ara about that. Tosas there talks about this nidon of Yesh Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos or Ein Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos. This ties into our previous discussion. There is a man da'amar who says Yesh Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos, meaning even though Bein HaShmoshes it was Muchan, now that it became Mukta on Shabbos, it remains Mukta because you've undone the Hachana. And the other man da'amar says no, while it's Mukta on Shabbos it's Mukta, but as soon as it ceases to be Mukta, the reason for the Mukta goes away, it ceases to be Mukta because it was Muchan on Erev Shabbos. That's the explanation of the Machlokas, whether Yesh Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos or Ein Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos. Now Tosas makes a distinction between in the second answer Tosas says Inami Hadi Yesh Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos Hanu L'Achila V'Lo L'Tiltul. He makes a distinction between the Isra Achila and the Isra Tiltul, and I just want to mention this as part of our general knowledge of understanding Mukta. There is a Chasam Sofer who argues, based really on Gemaras in Beitzah, that there's two reasons for Mukta. There's this quasi-derisa reason of Mukta that it's not Muchan, and there's a second reason of Mukta, which is in order to avoid you doing melachos of some sort or other. In other words, a lot of Muktas are associated with melachos. I mean, all Mukta, all Kelim have the potential of Hutzah, of carrying them needlessly, and many Mukta items have connections to other melachos. A pen is a pen you could use for writing, or money for transactions, and so on and so forth. So there's two reasons in essence why, let's say, a pen would be Mukta on Shabbos. Reason number one is even though it's a Kli, and all Kelim are Muchan, but it's a Kli Shemalachta and Issa. It's designed for Issa use, therefore it's not Muchan. That would be reason number one. Reason number two would be an obvious Gezerah. If you have a pen, you're likely to move it. So there are basically two reasons for Mukta. One is this din of Hachana, the Hichinu, that things should be prepared for Shabbos. Shabbos isn't just a time of Issa Malacha, but it's also a time of Hachana. Everything should be Muchan, which is either Deraisa, the Hichinu is a Shei of you, or Chazal understood it as part of the themes of Shabbos, and therefore it's a Drabanon, but built on the concept of what Shabbos is about. And the second reason is because of Mukta ideas. The Chasam Sofer suggests, and we could read this well into the Gemara, into Tosfos, that with respect to Issa Achila, the Issa is Veichinu. The Pasuk actually is talking about eating, it's talking about the Mon. So eating items need to be Muchan from Erev Shabbos. Other Kelim don't need to be Muchan from Erev Shabbos. That's an Issa Tiltul because of the Gezerah of Melacha. And that would then explain Tosfos why there's this distinction between Tiltul and Achila. Achila is determined by Bein HaShmoshes, by Achana, and Tiltul is determined by the Issa Mukta and the general Issa Mukta. This is one other ha'ara I wanted to say. And the final point I'll make, simply because I was asked to talk about it, is about Gomro B'dei Adam, which also Tosfos references, and I was asked very briefly to discuss it. The logic of Gomro B'dei Adam is as follows. If you have something that is Mukta Bein HaShmoshes, it's set aside, unable to be used Bein HaShmoshes, it's Mukta. That's what we just discussed. But what happens if it's within my control, or it will definitely cease to be Mukta at some point on Shabbos? I have a method of making it stop being Mukta. For example, removing it from the flame and therefore it won't be boiling hot, or clothes which are drying, where I know that no matter what the weather, it will dry. It's not clothes hanging up outdoor where there can be a burst of rainfall and therefore it may remain Mukta, but it's clothes in my drying machine where I know that half an hour after the start of Shabbos, it wouldn't be Mukta. So here we say that at least at that point where it ceases to be non-functional, it would cease to be Mukta. That's the concept of Gomru B'dei Adam. And arguably, even from the start of Shabbos, it's not Mukta because it's in my control to make it non-Mukta. So just to summarize, Bein HaShmashos is the determinant of Mukta because of the idea of Hachana and Veichinu and Gomru B'dei Adam undermines that logic because it says even though now at this moment at the start of Shabbos it's not usable, but it's within my ability to make it usable and I'm planning to make it usable or it automatically will become usable and therefore that's enough to make it not Mukta from the start. And whether it becomes Mukta, at that point it's Mukta when it's still unusable, and the point is it then ceases to be Mukta or is never Mukta is a subject that we'll look at in other sugyas. So we'll stop there, and I'm sorry that we've overshot our time, but I hope that gives a little bit more of an introduction to the concepts of Mukta. Oh, is everyone a good Shavuos? Yeah.
Philip and I have been using the reading. He's got the Bar and it didn't have this latest volume, and I see that 3/4 of this latest volume is
Mukta, yes.
Plus the fact that it refers to other
yeah, I know. Yeah, Mukta is overwhelming, yeah.